by all means.
Yeah,
Now,
sure.
can you hear me all right? Because this
Yes, this is working just
computer
fine.
it's one of these modern laptops where you have to speak right into it to be, it's a new one. Yeah.
Excellent. Yes, the
Okay,
sound quality is
good.
very good. If I could ask everyone to mute themselves, otherwise
Apart from
I
me,
will do it
thank you.
for you. Yes. All right. Thank you. And let's get started.
Work. Can you, oh no, what's happened? One moment, sorry, carry on
No
talking
problem.
among yourselves.
No problem.
I'm not quite sure why this isn't working. It was earlier. Oh, there it is, good.
There it goes. Now you go back.
No, it should be all right.
Good. Excellent.
Let me first say thank you to all of you for finding time to listen to this lecture tonight, and especially to friends who are joining for the first time. Not sure there is anybody there at the moment, but anybody does. Before I begin, I want to recommend a book which was published in 2002, Black Tom, Arnold of Rugby, The Myth and the Man, by Terence Copley. He includes 2 paragraphs of explanation for American readers. This sentence may be particularly helpful. The meaning of public school in the US context is entirely opposite to its eccentric meaning in the UK, where it has come to mean an independent school, i.e. independent from government, centralized or local education authority, or school board control, and therefore a fee-paying school. My object has been to bring the great principles of the gospel home to the hearts and practices of my countrymen in my own time, and particularly to those of my own station in society, with whose sentiments and language I am naturally most familiar. And for this purpose, I have tried to write in such a style as might be used in real life, in serious conversation with our friends, or with those who ask our advice, in the language, in short, of common life, ennobled and strengthened by those principles and feelings which are to be found only in the gospel. Dr. Thomas Arnold wrote these words in the preface to the first volume of his sermons, which was published in 1828, just before he took up the position for which posterity mostly remembers him, as the headmaster of Rugby School. The sermons printed in that volume included those that were preached in the pulpit of All Saints Church in Laleham, where a memorial brass was placed 70 years later in 1898 by the former Dean of Durham, who was by then the most senior surviving pupil of Dr. Arnold. It began with these words: "To the memory of Thomas Arnold, D.D., Headmaster of Rugby, 1828 to 1842, Regius Professor of Modern History in the University of Oxford, 1841 to 1842, scholar, historian, and theologian, who, as the head of a great public school, raised the character of all English education." To most people in the 21st century, Dr. Arnold is an unknown historical figure. Some may have heard of him as the father of Matthew Arnold, the Victorian poet and critic. To others, he is the self-righteous blockhead of Lytton Strachey's vicious vilification. In an earlier talk, I showed how much I vehemently disagreed with Strachey's demonizations. Nevertheless, I freely admit that Thomas Arnold certainly did have his flaws. He had a volcanic temper and could lash out at anyone who contradicted him, especially anyone who lied to him. He showed naivety in believing that he could trust the word of a boy and would be furious if he found out that the boy had been lying to him with painful consequences for the young offender. However, many still recall the doctor as the most famous headmaster of Rugby School. Indeed, Rugby School's website still acknowledges that. Yet there was much more to him than just a headmaster. There's a print of this painting literally to the right of me at the moment. The wall. Contemporaries and near contemporaries knew of him as a moderately liberal churchman who helped pioneer biblical criticism in this country, and a Christian moralist whose sermons were read by many far beyond his congregations. As an avid pamphleteer in the causes of both social and ecclesiastical reform, who saw clearly the negative effects of early industrialization. As an ancient historian who wrote 3 massive volumes on the history of Rome, but also packed the Sheldonian Theatre in Oxford for his inaugural lectures as Regius Professor of Modern History, and as a classicist who produced a 3-volume edition of Thucydides. My own intention is to show that Arnold was, in the words of an author of 1909, more than just a great schoolmaster. He was a historian, a divine, a politician. I hope to write a book that concentrates on Dr. Arnold, not as a headmaster, but as a Christian thinker, churchman, historian, and classicist. After his former headmaster's sudden and unexpected death in 1842, Arthur Penryn Stanley collected Arnold's correspondence and published a best-selling 2-volume biography. In fact, the first of those 2-volume biographies, so much disliked by a straight sheet. Following on from him, all major studies of Dr. Arnold have given only short or passing references to his role as a historian and classicist. Stanley's own relationship with the doctor was built on his experience as his pupil at Rugby. Arnold was first and foremost the headmaster, the schoolmaster, the religious controversialist, as well as Stanley's spiritual mentor and lately the family man. These are the emphases placed on him by later biographers. Even when writing of Arnold's inaugural lectures on modern history, Stanley makes no effort at historiographical analysis. Stanley's concentration on Arnold as headmaster of Rugby and Christian moralist was soon enhanced by the publication in 1857 of the semi-biographical Tom Brown's School Days, written by another of Arnold's former pupils, Thomas Brown. Years later, Stanley gave, then Dean of Dean Stanley, gave an address to the boys of Rugby School on the 32nd anniversary of his great headmaster's death, June the 12th, 1874. He made us understand that the only thing for which God supremely cares, the only thing that God supremely loves, is goodness. That the only thing which is supremely hateful to God is wickedness. But religion, the true religion of Jesus Christ, consists in that which makes us wiser and better, more truthful, more loving, more tender, more considerate, more pure, Therefore, in his view, there was no time or place in which religion is shut out. There is no time or place where we cannot be serving God by serving our fellow creatures. Thomas Arnold was born in West Cowes on the Isle of Wight on the 13th of June, 1795, the seventh child of William and Martha Arnold. His father was both the postmaster and the collector of customs for the Isle of Wight. The family had been settled there for 2 generations after they moved from their original residence in Lowestoft, Suffolk. William's father had given up farming and joined the excise, moving to Aylesbury and then to Poole. William's family had met Martha's family, the Delafields, in Aylesbury. Martha was the daughter of a successful businessman. She and William were married at Holborn on the 6th of April, 1779. Theirs was to be a happy marriage, blessed with 7 children. However, tragedy soon struck, and Thomas was to be the only son to survive to early manhood, survive beyond early manhood, and remained responsible for his mother and siblings even after his own marriage. His father died suddenly at the age of 55 on the 3rd of March, 1801, suffering from pains in the chest from what Stanley described as a spasm in the heart. The actual cause of his death was put down to angina pectoris, from which Thomas himself would also succumb unexpectedly in 1842. Angina is now regarded as a symptom, and the cause was probably ischemic heart disease. Thomas's education was first assigned to his mother's sister Susan until he went to Lord Weymouths Grammar School in Warminster in 1803. It was known as a grammar school because its teaching focused on Greek and Latin grammar. The school is now known as Warminster School. Arnold was very happy there. 4 years later, in 1807, he entered Winchester College, remaining there until 1811. While at Warminster, I don't know, wonder if Sophie's read these, the one on the left. While at Winchester, he developed his capacity to be a vociferous reader. Thomas read through the massive History of Greece by William Whitford and twice through Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. While still in his 16th year, he won a scholarship to Corpus Christi College in Oxford and obtained a first-class degree in Literae Humaniores. What I can do with that? Oh, sorry. Wait a minute, let me show you this. Hold on, there you go. Let me repeat this bit back. While still in his 16th year in 1811, he won a scholarship to Corpus Christi College in Oxford and obtained a first-class degree in Literae Humaniores, Classics, 3 years later. He was elected as a Fellow of Oriel College the following year, receiving the Chancellor's prizes for his 2 essays in English and Latin in 1815 and 1817, respectively. The principal of Oriel is known as the Provost, and that office had been held by John Eveley for over 40 years. He had introduced radical reform, opening up the scholarship, the college to fellowships, opening up the college fellowships to literary ability rather than clubbable geniality, and forcing a public university on the university as a whole for the BA degree. Edward Cobblestone succeeded him the year after, before Arnold arrived, and was later become the Bishop of Llandaff in Wales. Arnold's own fellowship was due to the intervention of the eccentric but very intellectual Richard Wakeley, who later was to become the Archbishop of Dublin narrowly succeeding in selection over Arnold himself. They were to become close friends for the remainder of Arnold's life. He was, incidentally, the ancestor of the actor Kevin Wakeley, who played Inspector Lewis. There was a formidable and high-powered senior common room. Several of the fellows became known as noetics, from the Greek noetikos, which by 1882 edition of Liddell and Scott translated as quick of perception, intelligent. The word refers to that which pertains to the mind or intellect. Arnold and Wakeley were prominent among them, as was the future Bishop of Hereford, Wren Dixon Hampton, whose appointment to the Regius Professorship of Divinity Arnold was to defend in his ferocious attack on the Tractarians in 1836. These men were united in their liberal advocacy of university and ecclesiastical reform, in their avowed adherence to the Reformation and to the royal supremacy, in their fierce opposition to the notion that the church should be identified with the clergy, and to what Arnold was later described as priestcraft, and then their desire to open up the church to the laity. Theologically, they opposed both the bibliolater and the rationalist, seeking fearlessly to apply historical criticism to the study of the Bible. Another friendship that Arnold was to form at Oriel was with the saintly John Keeble, who had been an earlier undergraduate of Corpus Christi. Their friendship was later to rupture over their fiercely opposing positions in relation to the Oxford movement. Thomas was racked with doubts about ordination, and especially about the 39 Articles of Religion, the doctrinal formulation of the Church of England, subscription to which remained requisite for ordination until 1976. He consulted colleagues and also the Bishop of Oxford. Edward Legge, Bishop of Oxford, ordained Arnold as a deacon in Christ Church Cathedral on the 20th of December, 1818. But Arnold remained a deacon for the next decade because of his misgivings on the Articles. On the 21st anniversary of his ordination, 1839, he wrote to Stanley, "I had enough and more than enough of scruples and difficulties, not before only, but afterwards for a long time." It was not until the 1st of June, 1828, that he was ordained priest by William Hooley, the Bishop of London, who was to be elected Archbishop of Canterbury in July. Arnold consented only after he had been appointed headmaster of Rugby, which he deemed it necessary for the full exercise of his pastoral duties to be able to administer Holy Communion. Thomas married Henry Penrose on the 11th of August, 1820, in Fledborough, Nottinghamshire. She was the sister of his school friend Trevenian Penrose and the daughter of the rector, John Penrose. The family were of strong Cornish stock, and Mary had been born in Carwithnach in Cornwall in 1791 and was thus 4 years Thomas's senior. The family had moved to Fledborough in 1801. John had held the living in plurality with his Cornish parishes, quite common practice in those days, since 1783. Thomas had visited Trevenian in the new year of 1819 and fallen in love with Mary by midsummer. The following summer, they were married by Mary's father. It was to be a happy and productive marriage and partnership. They had 7 children by 1828, though one daughter died only a few days old. Each was given a nickname. Matthew was born at Christmas 1822 and was known as Crab or Crabby, but usually Matt with 1 T. By the time of his marriage, Arnold had already embarked on his career as a schoolmaster. The provost of Oriel, Edward Hawkins, had advised him that he was quite unsuited to a parish ministry. Arnold's brother-in-law, John Buckland, the brother of the famous geologist William Buckland, had already opened a small but flourishing school in Hampton. Buckland wanted to start a preparatory school and offered Arnold a partnership. A prep school was a novel idea 200 years ago. In the summer of 1819, the two of them bought a house in Laleham near Staines. Thus, by the time he was married, Arnold was already a householder, but was also in debt. He was remained there for nearly 9 years. It was a long day. The boys were woken up at 7 a.m. and the school day did not finish until prep was over at 9 p.m. From 1823, the curriculum consisted of classics, divinity, geography, mathematics, and algebra. Teaching included lectures, class lessons, and individual tutorials. On Sundays, Buckland and Arnold conducted matins and sometimes evensong at All Saints, the parish church of Laleham. Arnold was happy and content at Laleham, and his family was growing. He twice turned down offers to become the second master at Winchester College, and was very reluctant to apply for the post of headmaster of Rugby school, believing that he was ill-suited and unqualified for such a responsible position. The vacancy arose from the resignation of Dr. Wool, who had held the post for 21 years, in August 1827. There were some 50 applicants, and Arnold did not think that he stood a chance. Testimonials were sent to the trustees on his behalf. In September, Edward Hawkins, the provost of Oriel, wrote to him. Wakeley pressed on Arnold that he should apply. When he finally relented, it was Hawkins's testimonial that clinched it. Hawkins predicted that if Arnold was elected to the mastership, he would change the face of education throughout the public schools. This claim, though much quoted, remains hotly debated. There were then only 7 public schools in existence. The Arnolds now had 8 months to prepare before leaving Rugby in August 1828. In the midst of other demands on his time, he somehow found time and energy to embark on academic work on his own in philology and history. He began work on a Greek lexicon of Thucydides. Arnold also started work on a short history of Greece, which was never completed nor published. In 1822, he began work on the history of Rome from the Gracchi to Trajan for the Encyclopedia Metropolitana. He managed to reach the end of the reign of Augustus and write a short biography of the Emperor Trajan. These were posthumously published in 2 volumes. In 1825, Archdeacon Julius Charles Hare introduced him to the work of the German historian Barthold Georg Niebuhr. Eugene Williamson wrote, considering the range of Arnold's other interests and duties, his productions in the historical field were surprisingly numerous and weighty. He then listed these works and concluded, in all these works, except the lectures on modern history, he was, by his own admission, indebted to the historian and statesman Barthold Niebuhr, 1776 to 1830. In the excepted work, he stated that his ultimate end, the writing of an internal institutional history of the kind produced by Niebuhr. In order to read Niebuhr, Dr. Arnold had found time to learn German. He then oversaw the translation of, it was actually, yes, Barthold Georg Niebuhr's works into English by two of his fellow liberal Anglican historians. Arnold asserted that Niebuhr and Mitford were the first modern discoverers in Grecian and Roman history, the giants who cut through the rocks. T.W. Bamford wrote of Arnold as a pupil of Niebuhr, and more recently, Terence Copley has echoed the simile of a teacher-pupil relationship with Arnold as the pupil. Bamford asserted that Arnold echoed Niebuhr's demand for a study of history in the scientific spirit, together with an appreciation of values and the social life of the people. Professionally, as a classical historian, Niebuhr was his master. Behind Niebuhr was the great 17th century Italian historian Giambattista Vico and his seminal work, The New Science. Time does not allow me to go into what has been called the liberal Anglican idea of history. Arnold was a central figure among liberal Anglicans who drew upon the cyclical view of history, which was central to Vico's science of history. Let me at least explain one aspect of this, which is central to Arnold. He called it the social progress of nations, of states, the social progress of states. It demonstrates two important points. Firstly, and most emphatically, they rejected the rationalists' idea of progress. This was very prevalent right up until the First World War. The general belief that humanity was on an inevitable upward curve of civilization. In its place, they put their faith in the providence of God. Secondly, the idea was not truly cyclical in the sense advocated by Polybius, that states inevitably return back to where they started in their form of government. For the liberal Anglicans, the history of individual nation states mirrored that of the individual person. Julius Hare summarized it succinctly. The natural life of nations, as well as of individuals, has its fixed course and term. It springs forth, grows up, reaches its maturity, decays, perishes. What is cyclical is that this historical law, they maintain, is true of every civilization and society throughout history. Arnold, always an Aristotelian rather than a Platonist, was moving away from this view towards the end of his life. I am myself so much inclined to the idea of a strong social bond that I ought not to be suspected of any tendency to anarchy. Yet I begin to think that the idea is overstrained, and that this attempt to merge the soul and the will of the individual man in the general body is, when fully developed, contrary to the very essence of Christianity. After all, it is the individual soul that must be saved. In his early years at Rugby, Arnold produced a notable commentary to his own massive 3-volume edition of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. The volumes were annotated with Latin notes, which were later exchanged for English ones. Each volume had its own preface and detailed maps. He testified that his own strong love for history had been working in me for so many years, and saw its ultimate worth in the truth it teaches. He then went on to write 3 substantial volumes on the history of Rome, stretching from the foundation myths to the Second Punic War. Gooch observed in Arnold's History of Rome that his strength grows as he advances, and the third volume is as superior to the second as the second to the first. Niebuhr's friend, Chevalier, later Baron Christian Charles Bunsen, praised, sorry, going back a bit, praised Arnold's ambitious plans to extend to the coronation of Charlemagne. His early death meant that he was unable to fulfill that dream. The doctor, as he became known, he got his doctorate when he became, just about the time he became headmaster of Rugby from Oxford. The doctor also gave his own reasons for his continued emphasis on a classical curriculum. The history of Greece and Rome is not an idle inquiry about remote ages and foreign institutions, but a living picture of things present, fitted not so much for the curiosity of the scholar as for the instruction of the statesman and citizen. He wrote his own apologia for the prominence of classics, which was published in an article in the Quarterly Journal of Education for 1834, entitled Rugby School, Use of Classics. Here are some extracts. Expel Greek and Latin from your schools, and you confine the views of the existing generation to themselves and their immediate predecessors. But the mind of the Greek and of the Roman is in all the essential points of its constitution our own. And not only so, but it is our own mind developed to an extraordinary degree of perfection. Aristotle and Plato and Thucydides and Cicero and Tacitus are most untruly called ancient writers. They are virtually our own countrymen and contemporaries. Debate. Nevertheless, Arnold continued with a caveat and a proviso. All this supposes indeed the classical instruction should be sensibly conducted. It requires that a classical teacher should be fully acquainted with modern history and modern literature, no less than with those of Greece and Rome. Arthur Hugh Clough outlined for an American magazine the immense amount of classical reading he had undertaken under Arnold's supervision in the sixth form, and how consequently he had found the standard at Oxford very disappointing. Little Strachey derided Arnold's educational reforms as tentative and few, and the boy's main study remained the dead languages of Greece and Rome. Dr. Arnold was, in fact, the first headmaster of a public school to appoint a German master. Dr. Mobley, Arnold's contemporary as headmaster of Winchester, testified to Arnold's devoted pupil and first biographer, Arthur Penryn Stanley, that a most singular and striking change has come upon our public schools. This change is undoubtedly part of a general improvement of our generation in respect to piety and reverence. He attributed that change mainly to Dr. Arnold's personal earnest simplicity of purpose, strength of character, power of influence, and piety. For Dr. George Mobley, who later became the Bishop of Salisbury, Arnold was quite simply the first. While Thomas Arnold was still a schoolboy at Winchester, Sidney Smith had written his article on public schools for the Edinburgh Review of 1810. The vital and essential part of a school is the master, but at a public school, no boy, or at the best, only a very few, can see enough of him to derive any considerable benefit from his character, manners, and information. Arnold set about to change that. Thomas Hughes puts into the mind of Tom Brown, newly arrived, and this reflection. But he had found the school and schoolhouse in a state of monstrous license and misrule, and was still employed in the necessary but unpopular work of setting up order with a strong hand. Masters had been, that's male teachers here, had been poorly paid and had lived out. They came in simply to teach and to discipline. Arnold gave them a proper salary, but expected much in return. They would live in the school and give up their often poorly paid curacies, they were all ordained, and be put in charge of school houses. Boys in public schools were, and still are, divided into associational groups known as houses, which compete with each other. They lived in the buildings assigned to their houses and slept there in dormitories. The masters were to become their housemasters and oversee each house. This model spread and still exists today for boarders in public schools. Arnold was especially involved with the sixth form, whom he sought to prepare for their departure to go into the world as Christian gentlemen. He gave them serious responsibilities and chose his praepostors, prefects, from among them, who reported directly to him and with whom he had regular meetings. The headmaster's study was at the top of the tower, in the building which accommodated his schoolhouse. Dr. Arnold ordered the building of a flight of steps to the study to allow the boys some privacy in coming to see him, and the flagstaff was erected. According to Norman Weymouths' book, which focused on Dr. Arnold as headmaster, when the flag was flying, it was a signal that Arnold was at home and that he would be pleased to see any boy who wished to talk to him. No prior appointment was necessary. He invited boys of all ages and chatted with them about subjects commensurate with their age. As a father might talk to his children, this is still a quotation, as a father might talk to a son, he discussed their future, inquired into their home life, and displayed an intelligent interest in their hobbies. Tea time was, when possible, a time he to spend with his family. They would, however, frequently be joined by some of the boys. Dr. Arnold's sermons had an impact on those who heard them in the chapel, and which would be with them for the rest of their lives. The 16-year-old Stanley wrote to his sister, "Whatever happens in the week to diminish my respect for him, it always comes back on the Sunday when I hear him preaching." Tom Brown felt that he spoke for many other boys than himself, and such thoughts were semi-autobiographical for the real Thomas Hughes, who had sat listening to the doctor week after week in the chapel, as his life was changed forever. But we listened, as all boys in a better mood will listen, to a man whom we felt to be, with all his heart and soul and strength, striving against whatever was mean and unmanly and unrighteous in our little world. It was the warm, living voice of one who was fighting for us and by our sides, and calling on us to help him and ourselves and one another. He who roused this consciousness in them showed them at the same time, by every word he spoke in the pulpit and by his whole daily life, how the battle was to be fought, and stood there before them as his fellow soldier and captain in their band. Gladstone read 30 of Arnold's sermons between the 1st of May and the 10th of June, 1829, and read them aloud in December, 1829. In a letter to William Wyndham, written from Oxford in 1830, Gladstone spoke of Arnold as a most superior man, and added, should you see his sermons, look at them and blame me if you do not find them worth the trouble. Julius Charles Hare, Archdeacon of Lewes, issued an English translation of Niebuhr's History of Rome, together with his colleague Connor Thirlwell, then later Bishop of St. David's. After reading the third volume of Arnold's History of Rome, Hare paid tribute to his late friend in his archidiaconal charge of 1843, entitled The Wants of the Church. Arnold, who had a deeper feeling than any man, perhaps, of his own standing, for the evils in the social condition of England, and who, directly and indirectly, had done more than almost any other single man, though but a small part of what he desired and meditated for remedying them. 40 years on, later, the moderator of the Church of Scotland, John Tullock, wrote, if ever there was a mind intensely English in the practical ethical bent underlying all his studies and all his work, it was Arnold's. In his religious convictions, as in much else, his mentor, alongside Richard Hooker and Bishop Butler, was Samuel Taylor Coleridge, whose nephew, Mr. Justice Coleridge, remained a lifelong friend. This can be seen in the polemical and controversial pamphlet of 1833, The Principles of Church Reform, on which he joined the debate on the relationship between church and state and outlined why the Church of England urgently needed reform. The issue had been raised by Coleridge 3 years earlier on the Constitution of Church and State. The enfranchisement of dissenters and their admission to Parliament, together with full Roman Catholic emancipation, opened the way for the Whig reforms of the 1830s, which further undermined the constitutionally privileged position of the Church of England. The Reform Act of 1832 gave the vote to a much larger body of dissenters, those Protestant denominations outside the Church of England. Many Tories and churchmen feared the danger of the Whig government surrendering completely to the demand of dissenters and radicals, even to the disestablishment and disendowment of the Church. Meanwhile, the Church of England faced internal and external problems, which developed into a crisis in the early 1830s. Arnold had written a pamphlet in support of Catholic emancipation and was a strong supporter of the new Whig government. The article was later republished in Arnold's Miscellaneous Works. These are the British and American first editions, as was the Principles of Church Reform. Elsewhere, Arnold stated, conservatism is always wrong. According to Stanley, liberal principles were not merely the expression of his adherence to a Whig ministry, but of his belief in the constant necessity of applying those principles of advance and reform, which, in the most perfect development, he conceived to be identical with Christianity itself. Coleridge had upheld the object of the national church, the third estate of the realm, was to secure and improve that civilization without which the nation could be neither permanent nor progressive. For Arnold, the identity of church and state under royal supremacy was the very cornerstone of my belief. He wrote in his pamphlet on the supposition that the church establishment was in extreme danger. The church, as it now stands, no human power can save. Wakeley believed that the days of church establishment were numbered. John Keeble was in in no doubt the die for separation is cast. Arnold argued that the union of church and state was essential, but that the established church suffered from its own exclusivity. It needed to be organic and comprehensive. The existence of dissent divided the effort of Christians. Therefore, they should be encouraged no longer to dissent. His liberal vision was of the church of the lowest common denominator. Dogmatic formulations should be replaced by a minimal requirement to believe in the Trinity, the divine inspiration of Holy Scripture, and to uphold similar moral and ethical standards. All non-essentials should be removed as qualifications for membership. Only Quakers, Unitarians, and Roman Catholics needed to be excluded. Quakers, because of their attitude to the civil power, Unitarians, because of their denial of the Holy Trinity, and Roman Catholics, because they could not acknowledge the royal supremacy. The pamphlet was to set him into a headlong collision with the new Oxford movement, dogmatically and rigidly steeped in their own version of Catholicism, pouring forth tracts on ecclesiology, doctrine of the church, patristics, and sacramentology. Arnold lashed out at them in a highly polemical pamphlet entitled The Oxford Malignance, and published in the Edinburgh Review in 1836. What particularly grated with Arnold was what he termed their priestcraft, their identification of the church with clergy endowed with a sacred exclusivity through the laying on of hands by bishops in apostolic succession. The principles of church reform, Arnold had canvassed for a much greater role for the laity. He was infuriated by their assault on his own old friend from Oriel and fellow noetic Wren Dixon Hampton on grounds of heresy after his appointment to the Regius Professorship of Divinity. In his classic study on the Oxford movement in 1890, Dean Church regarded the publication of Dr. Arnold's Oxford Malignance as a moment when the gathering storm broke furiously against the tract writers, making them the most unpopular and suspected body of men in the church. John Henry Newman, the vicar of St. Mary's, was in the former front of the Oxford movement. Newman became a Roman Catholic in 1845 and explained why he had done so in his Apologia Provita Sua of 1864. 15 years later, he was to become a cardinal and has recently been canonized. He had been a fellow of Oriel. This is what he wrote about Arnold. It was the success of the liberal cause which fretted me inwardly. I became fierce against its instruments and its manifestations. All this time, I was specially annoyed with Dr. Arnold, though it did not last into later years. Someone, I think, asked in conversation at Rome whether a certain interpretation of Scripture was Christian. It was answered that Dr. Arnold took it. I interposed, but is he a Christian? The subject went out of my head at once. When afterwards I was taxed with it, I could say no more in explanation than what I believe was the fact that I must have had in mind some free views of Dr. Arnold about the Old Testament. I thought I must have meant Arnold answers for the interpretation, but who is to answer for Arnold? In an age when biblical scholarship in England was on the defensive, and an almost universal belief in scriptural infallibility and literalism, Arnold sought to apply historical methods to the Bible and to demonstrate the progressive and preparatory nature of revelation in the Old Testament. He remained true to the Noetics in their middle path between bibliolatry and skepticism. When Thomas Arnold was appointed Regius Professor of Modern History at Oxford in 1841, his inaugural lectures had to be moved to the Sheldonian Theatre, as the numbers are far more than anyone could have expected, far more than any professor has addressed in Oxford since the Middle Ages. Audiences were estimated between 400 and 500 for each lecture. The young Richard Church, future Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral and historian of the Oxford movement, to whom I referred a few minutes ago, wrote a glowing report of Arnold's inaugural lectures to Frederick Rogers. The great lion at the moment is Arnold and his lectures, which have created a great stir in the exalted, the literary, and the fashionable world of Oxford. People look forward to his lectures in the theatre day after day, as they might to a play. The historian G.M. Young wrote in the mid-20th century, "I cannot doubt that if Arnold had not been a schoolmaster, he would have been a very good historian." Unfortunately, Arnold's early and sudden death did not allow him to carry out his intention to increase an interest in history in Oxford. Dr. Arnold died suddenly in the evening of his 47th birthday, before his 47th birthday, 12th of June, 1842. This totally unexpected news sent shockwaves to the country. In Tom Brown's school days, Thomas Hughes entitles the final chapter as Finished. It is set in the summer of 1842, when Tom Brown joins friends for a fishing ramble in Scotland. While they were fishing, a reading man called out very abruptly, "Hello, Brown, here's something for you." "Why?" "Your old master, Arnold of Rugby, is dead." Brown felt completely carried off his moral and intellectual legs, as if he had lost his standing point in the invisible world. The shock was intensely personal in what was the first great wrench of his life. Hughes noted that Brown had to learn that the soul of man cannot stand or lean upon human prop, however wise, however strong and wise and good. Thank you.